we've seen some of the data that came out. I'm not sure if you've had the opportunity to read The Great Dechurching yet. I
Yeah.
know you're very well read, but we've seen now, we hear the stats, 41 million people have left the church over the last 25 years. 16% of the adult population. These weren't people that were fringe Christians. These were people that were considered to be the pillars necessarily in the church. I know you have seen so many of the different things that have gone on, but what do you think of that? I mean, what's your thought? Was that a
Yeah.
surprise to you to see that data, or is that right in line with what you've been seeing?
I have some issues with the data, frankly, as presented, partly because I am in my seventh decade of life. I'm in my mid-60s. And so I've seen this data, and I've learned how to read it over time. And I've seen the arguments made. There's obviously something to it. So I'm not detracting from it and saying there's nothing there. There is something there. But anyone who's surprised by this, I mean, frankly, hasn't really been watching what's been going on for decades. So this isn't something that just happened. This is something that that's being noticed. But there's some things that, first of all, what's the overarching question? The overarching question is what cultural conditions pertain or prevail at any given moment. And so, my entire adult life, and so, we're talking about, 50 years, a half century. We haven't been able as intelligent Christians to talk about this without the pattern of secularization. And the only question has been, how fast is it going? So even when in the 80s, 90s, and even a little bit beyond that, people were talking about American exceptionalism, it wasn't that secularization won't happen here or isn't happening here. It's just happening here more slowly. The other thing is that we basically know how it works. And it's exactly what is seen in the numbers about church attendance and religious participation. I'll say this: participation in Christian churches. So I don't think we've lost a lot of convictional, confessional, evangelical Christians. I think we've lost a lot of hangers-on and an awful lot of people for whom it was culturally convenient to identify as Christian and, quite frankly, to be involved in a Christian church. Once the social price of Christian conviction goes up, well, guess what? It doesn't take a marketing genius to figure out that people who are going to lose social capital but don't really believe in what the church teaches, they're not going to hang around. So, in other words, I find a few people who say they have deconstructed, and, they follow a pretty traditional narrative, but those numbers don't add up to what you're talking about, for instance, in that project. It's the numbers of people who were, attenders of one sort or another, but evidently weren't deeply committed Christians. I just don't meet that many people who, say, I was once a very deeply committed Christian and I still believe the same things. I just don't go to church anymore. I haven't met that species. I think the other thing that's not taken into consideration are, say, three trends. Number one, people get older. And so if you look at the religious participation numbers and church membership numbers from, say, the 1970s, well, most of the people who were adults then are either dead or, quite aged. They're certainly, I mean, you're talking about 50 years ago, so add 50 to adult. And I mean, you can see where that pattern goes. Well, I don't think any of us honestly thought all those numbers were going to continue. I mean, even the birth rate, that's the second thing. The birth rate has fallen significantly, and it has fallen among evangelicals, again, very significantly. And so, you look at a youth group, well, guess what? If you used to have 4 kids, now you have 1.5 kids, well, you're missing a bunch of kids. And it's not because they're not coming to church, it's because they're not there. Now, I do know that the numbers still indicate a precipitous fall off, but again, it's, I think, what we should have expected. And, I read that differently also because I'm a part of a church that 30 years ago was probably down to about 14 people and is now filled to the gills with hundreds of convictional young couples. My wife and I are among the old people in the church. And so there are 20-somethings. And, yesterday, Sunday morning when we were sitting in church, we're behind a bunch of families and, they're just babies and toddlers and preschoolers everywhere. And so I just want to say, I know what those numbers look like. And I think big evangelical ism, we all knew just wasn't going to last. But I think evangelical Christianity in terms of the gospel is as powerful as ever.
That's a very good point. Do you think that it's going to be more along that confessional church mentality, as you said, that the hangers-on are falling off, more of that Bonhoefferian idea of the confessing church as we move forward in this century?
Well, I mean it even deeper than Bonhoeffer. I mean it in the deeply creedal, confessional, say, Reformation sense. And that was part of what Bonhoeffer meant, but I want to go far beyond Bonhoeffer because in other words, I think it's a comprehensive affirmation of the truthfulness of the confession that binds us. And I think it's what keeps us. I mean, so here's the deal. When I was a teenager, I was in a big Southern Baptist megachurch. And by the way, there was a real church there and real spiritual formation. I was really fed the word, had wonderful spiritual influence in my life. But you know what? Our youth group was like the best thing in town. If you're a teenager, we had the best show in town. The music, the best in town. We had a gymnasium in our church, which back then was so revolutionary. People, couldn't believe it when they saw it. And so you could come play in the gymnasium. You could come hang out. You could, it was just a very popular place to be. Well, you know what? The world doesn't need us for our gym anymore, and we can't keep up anyway. So the world does not need us for entertainment anymore.
Oh yeah.
The world doesn't even really need us as a safe place to park teenagers and middle schoolers, because parents say, hey, they need friends. Let's get them some church friends. That world is basically evaporated. So guess what? We're about to find out who the Christians are and where the Christian churches are and how serious they are about preaching the gospel, reaching their communities, taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. So in other words, I'm basically not surprised by much of this at all. It's the younger guys who are surprised. The older guys are not surprised.